Hey, it's Lou, and here's the thing. Despite what you hear on the news, the world is actually getting a lot better. Health, wealth, safety, worker rights, life expectancy, literacy. There's undeniable empirical evidence that all these things are improving across the globe. Crime is down. There are fewer victims of rape, murder, war, and genocide. Yet, most people think the exact opposite. Only 6% of Americans think the world is getting better. In Australia and France, that number is 3%. Why are we so incorrectly pessimistic? Who's to blame? And how's it shaping our world? The number of people in extreme poverty fell by 137,000 people since yesterday. Oxford economist Max Roser points out that this could have been an accurate headline every single day for a 25-year period starting in 1990 based on averages. But that's not the type of information you typically find atop newspaper articles or sprawled across the bottom of TV screens, nor is the fact that global life expectancy increased by 5.5 years between 2000 and 2016, or that the number of war deaths has been declining since 1946. Consider this. In the 1990s, real-world homicide rates dropped over 40%, yet murder coverage increased over 500%. How do you make sense of that? Well, there's this well-documented thing called the negativity bias. Essentially, negativity makes more of an impact on us psychologically. Therefore, we're drawn to it. Stuart Soroka, a professor of communication studies and political science at the University of Michigan, told me this is an evolutionary development that alerts us to danger, that tells us when we need to change course. So, since the media is made by humans for humans, death, destruction, scandal, that's all covered ad nauseum on outlets across the political spectrum. Hell, I host a show called Wild Shit that focuses on corruption and human rights abuses. It often features disturbing amateur footage of protests and police violence. Relatedly, in his forthcoming book, The Anxiety Epidemic, University of Sussex psychologist Graham Davey explains that the ubiquity of smartphones allows us to witness disasters and terrorist attacks from multiple angles and on repeat. No wonder, then, that heavy news watchers report more anxiety, worse moods, and learned helplessness, which is associated with depression. Now, the way the news feeds into negativity bias, A, benefits their bottom line, and B, is useful if a tornado is bearing down on your house. But the problem is the stuff the news encourages us to be afraid of is often disconnected from reality or not properly contextualized. We get fooled into thinking random occurrences are persistent issues that require our attention. This poor risk assessment is related to something called the availability heuristic. A heuristic is a fancy academic word that essentially means a rule of thumb, and the availability heuristic reveals that you're more likely to think something is possible if it comes easily to mind. People overestimate the frequency of plane crashes, for instance, because there's something the media obsesses about.
Unleashing theories from the technical to the sinister. The pilot crashed the plane. Terrorism. The plane landed somewhere.
Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, whose book Enlightenment Now highlights many positive trends in the world and why we underestimate them, told me people are systematically mistaken about the dangers in life. They worry about terrorist attacks, for instance, but hard data reveals that things like falling off ladders or drowning in bathtubs are much more deadly. On a personal level, this is something I think about every time I wait in line entering a football stadium. We submit to pat-downs and metal detectors because of concerns about terrorism. But after the game, thousands of us stumble into the parking lot drunk to drive home. If stadiums cared about our safety, forget about searches on the way in. Give us breathalyzers on the way out. In 2016 alone, over 10,000 people died in drunk driving accidents in the US. This misperception of the real dangers in the world plays out on a national level, too. Pinker points out that the United States has launched 2 costly wars to combat terrorism. We've created the expensive and invasive Department of Homeland Security to address the issue. I was talking with a friend about this the other day, a guy I was with on 9/11 in Manhattan when we were in high school. He pointed out that a lot of people we know were affected by terrorism, and telling them that their fear is overblown or influenced by TV might ring hollow. I get that, and I can see that all this math about a rapidly improving world can change if a nuclear bomb goes off somewhere, which is an idea, frankly, I hear a lot on the news.
A nuclear war may break out any moment.
North Korea is escalating its rhetoric because Kim wants nuclear weapons to ensure the survival of his regime.
But my fear is we're not focusing on the empirically real threats, the most dangerous stuff, the things most likely to happen. Pinker told me the human mind runs off of narratives, anecdotes, and images, even though reason tells us we should discount them in favor of our best data. But honestly, I'm not sure people respect data. In an era of fake news accusations and a disdain for elite experts and academics, and an across-the-spectrum disgust with the establishment, we've turned away from reality and towards impressions. We often allow data that reveals decades of trends to be overshadowed by a cluster of high-profile events. As Bill Clinton was fond of saying, we should focus on the trend lines, not the headlines. Compounding this failure to contextualize, Pinker pointed out, is that most journalists, critics, and politicians are trained in the humanities, where statistical and evidence-based thinking are not emphasized. To that point, early in my career, I was told that sympathetic or charismatic characters are the best vehicles for storytelling. But what's engaging isn't always representative. That's why Pinker thinks statistical thinking should be integrated into the education system at an early stage. Another reason the media doesn't focus on positive stories, like say the fact that global literacy has more than doubled since 1960, is that journalists get caught up in the news of the day. We work on deadlines, and bad things like fires, massacres, and resignations often happen pretty quickly, so they fit neatly into the relentless news cycle. Good things, on the other hand, take a very long time to play out, and the progress is hard to follow. For instance, Charles Kenny, a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, told me the story of plunging world poverty has to do with incremental improvements in governments and societies across the globe. Things like investments in infrastructure, the expansion of an inclusive education system, a renewed focus on sanitation and hygiene. In other words, really unsexy stuff. That's a challenge for journalists in the clickbait world we unfortunately live in. But look, there's definitely a lot of legitimate bad news. There are countries at war. Poverty, disease, and lack of freedom persist. Climate change threatens the planet. Globally, the number of undernourished people has tragically ticked up since 2015. In the US, there's been a recent spike in drug overdoses. In previous episodes of Beme News, I highlighted the advance of authoritarianism in places like Turkey and Nicaragua. Kenny told me the average on a lot of quality of life categories is improving, but many individuals are still suffering. So perhaps pessimists aren't ignoring all the positive data. Rather, maybe they're just unsatisfied with the rate of change. As a New Yorker article on Pinker's new book concludes, the spirit of progress is also the spirit of discontent. Furthermore, Davey told me that as old problems fade away, new ones emerge. Income inequality, for instance, or the number of people who are living longer and therefore experiencing degenerative diseases like dementia and Parkinson's. Going even further back to the 18th century, Davey points out that as people started feeling safe from poverty, famine, and early death, they began to worry about social status. In other words, it's always something. But giving into a bleak vision of the world, especially when it's not supported by facts, is costly. Pessimism is often a self-fulfilling prophecy. We think the world is terrible and irredeemable, so we don't do anything as it gets shittier and shittier. And when we don't understand what policies have worked in the past, say the way Social Security has reduced poverty among the elderly, we're more prone to eliminate successful strategies. In the same vein, Pinker told me that cynics tend to disengage from political and social participation. They may find it pointless to vote or donate to charity. 43% of eligible voters did not vote in the 2016 US presidential election, for example. The primary reason being they just did not care enough about the candidates. On the other hand, all the focus on negativity has arguably inspired a lot of people. There's a record number of women, Native Americans, and members of the LGBT community running for office in the US this year. And when journalists highlight problems, Many times governments or volunteers step in to fix the issue. So maybe negativity is the first step towards change. However, I suspect that sometimes pessimism is a mere pose, a way to virtue signal that you understand that there are problems all over the world and you refuse to be some happy idiot. But in the face of all that positive data I shared, pessimism may simply be a sign that you're stubborn or that you inaccurately idealize a past that wasn't so great. I mean, we often talk about yesteryear like it was the golden age, but data shows that most problems today were worse back then. There were 2 world wars in the 20th century. We died younger. Things were particularly bad for minority groups who were more likely to face systemic discrimination. Today may be imperfect, for sure, but things are undeniably getting better. Okay, I'm gonna go live my life.